Welcome back to Global Money Talk, live from the New York Stock Exchange. Election Day in the United States is on November 5th and is only 20 days away. As we kicked off the week, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump held events in Pennsylvania. The vice presidential nominees were also campaigning. Governor Tim Walz in Wisconsin and Senator J.D. Vance in Minnesota, Illinois, as well as Iowa. Now, Harris and Trump have both announced new policy ideas, with Harris proposing credits for newborns and home buyers, while Trump suggested tax cuts on overtime pay, Social Security benefits, and breaks for auto loan interest and state and local taxes. Well, joining me today at the New York Stock Exchange for our market insight is Tobin Marcus, head of U.S. policy and politics at Wolfe Research. Tobin, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Well, the countdown to Election Day is on here in the U.S., and it's hard to believe, given everything that's happened so far in 2024, that it's around the corner. But first and foremost, I do want to get your perspective. So, given the possible outcomes, starting out with the presidential race, what do you expect?
Yeah, so look, I think we're headed for a close presidential election. I think that much is clear. That's always been our expectation. Even going back to the beginning of the year, we figured it'd be tight just based on how presidential elections have gone, for years and years now. The last two presidentials have been decided by very, very small groups of voters in a relatively small set of swing states. And I think the partisan fundamentals of the country are very closely divided. So, there have been some ups and downs in the polling. Again, it's been an incredibly tumultuous 3, 4, 5 months going back to Biden's disastrous first debate performance, eventually dropping out, the assassination attempts on Trump, the second debate. So the polling has swung a little bit, but it's still been, I think, surprisingly range-bound given how much news there is. I think that Harris probably has a slight edge. That's what the polling has pretty consistently indicated since August. Very, very narrow leads in enough states to get to 270 electoral votes, which is the key target. Betting markets in the past 2 weeks or so have been swinging back a little bit in Trump's favor. I think that narrative, the sort of talk about a vibe shift in the election, has a little bit outpaced any actual developments on the ground. So I'm not yet convinced that there's been some big durable shift back in Trump's favor, but from an investor perspective, you can debate whether it's 55-45 one direction or the other, but over the course of the next 3 weeks, I think it is certainly going to be the case that we're going to have too little confidence about the outcome for most big institutional players to be wanting to make big directional bets one way or another. The folks that we're talking to in terms of our clients are very much still in scenario planning mode, trying to understand, what do the outcomes look like in these different worlds, rather than making a confident prediction about who's going to win and slamming trades as a result.
And Tobin, you've highlighted how eventful and tumultuous this year has been for the presidential candidates. And only months ago, Biden was still in the race. So when we think about Harris's campaign cycle, it is a very short one, and one that has been highlighted, especially as the debate, the first and only debate, took off between them. And of course, when it came to the vice presidential debate, all eyes and ears were on that debate, more so than previous vice presidential debates, just given the nature of this election cycle. But you brought up your conversations that you're having with investors as well as clients. So what have been some common themes that you have noticed? Yeah,
so there have definitely been some cycles to the way that that big institutional buy-side players have engaged with this election. I think through the first half of the year, there was some kind of ambient planning, wanting to understand the basic contours of the election, the kind of high points of the policy agendas on both sides. And then we really saw, after the first debate, when it looked like Trump might just be cruising to an easy victory before Biden dropped out, after Biden's numbers collapsed, so before he dropped out, I think that's when we really started to see folks tuning in, deciding that they needed to get their head around, all right, if Trump really is just on a glide path to victory, such that we're going to be able to plan around that for most of the year, then we need to figure out the content of that agenda. And then we've seen things shifting back a little bit more in the other direction recently. So, there have been, I think, certainly some persistent big questions about the policy landscape under these candidates. On the Trump side, I think we've spent a lot of time talking about tariffs, which obviously have been a center point of his economic agenda, something that he has tremendous discretion to do what he wants to do without a lot of need to go through Congress, and where he's proposed an incredibly aggressive agenda. So we've had a lot of conversations about what could really happen there. to some extent, a similar story on immigration, where if he really succeeded in deporting 15 or 20 million people, it would have incredibly disruptive consequences. But probably we're not going to end up with something at that scale. And then tax policy, I think no matter who wins next year, we're looking at a huge tax cliff in the U.S. as the individual tax cuts from the 2017 Trump tax package are set to expire at the end of next year. And so that creates a lot of variability in what could happen in terms of tax policy next year. Very different outcomes, of course, depending on whether we get Trump with a Republican sweep, Trump with divided government, Harris with divided government. I think somewhat less likely, Harris with a Democratic sweep. But that's where, for example, some of the risks around clean energy, I think, are primarily in that space, where it's possible, in the context of a big party line Republican fiscal bill next year, that's where we could see some changes to the Inflation Reduction Act, for example.
And Tobin, we're here at the New York Stock Exchange. We continue to see record highs for the major U.S. equity averages, but it has been quite the volatile year given everything that's happened. And of course, when it comes to the macro landscape as well as policy landscape in terms of monetary policy, there are so many expectations as we headed into this year, but here we are heading into the final months of the year as well as the final quarter. So I do want to dive into the other parts of politics in terms of the election. So the race for Congress, what's going on there right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So down ballot from the presidential, I think the clearest picture is at the Senate level, where the Senate map this year very strongly favors Republicans. They've effectively already flipped one seat with the retirement of Joe Manchin, who's now an independent, caucuses with Democrats. That's a deep red state that Manchin was the only Democrat or Democratic-leaning senator who had any chance of winning. So that's effectively as good as gone. Beyond that, Republicans just need to pick off one more seat, with Montana being the obvious race. John Tester, Democratic incumbent, has been trying to defend that seat, but Trump is going to win Montana by 15 to 20 points. I think that is too big of a deficit for even a strong Democratic incumbent in Tester to survive. So that alone would be enough to deny Democrats a Senate majority, even if Harris wins. If Trump wins, the job is already done. They don't even need to flip Montana because they get to 50 already in West Virginia. So the Senate's very lopsided. The House, I think, is much more evenly split. Our expectation has always been that the House will go the same way as the presidency. They're obviously correlated outcomes. They tend to go the same way. But there has been a debate in D.C. I think there's been a little bit of, frankly, a little bit of a lazy conventional wisdom that, we're going to have divided government one way or another. Even if Trump wins, he'll probably have a Democratic House, just like Harris will have a Republican Senate. But we've never thought that there's good evidence for that view. I think if you, we've seen some analysts kind of saying, well, Trump's 50-50 to win, and then if Trump wins, he's 50-50 to have Democratic House across from him. But that implies something in the neighborhood of a 75% chance that Democrats win the House, and I don't think that there's any evidence that Democrats have that magnitude of edge. So, to us, that adds up to a pretty bimodal distribution of outcomes, where there's a very small chance of a blue sweep on the far left, and then a high chance of a divided government under Harris with a Republican Senate, and then again a very small chance of Trump plus a Democratic House, and a large chance of Trump with the Republican sweep. So, we think that the two big scenarios investors should be planning around are, on the one hand, divided government under Harris, and on the other hand, Republican trifecta under Trump.
And Tobin, now that we've set the table for today's discussion, I do want to take a look at betting markets. So for our viewing audience who may not be familiar, can you explain the intricacies of this and how this actually works?
Yeah, so there are a few different sources of market odds that people tend to look at as points of comparison for the polling, sources of expectations about the elections. The two big kind of market-based indicators are Predicted and Polymarket, the latter being a longer-standing venue that's operated under a sort of non-enforcement from U.S. securities regulators with relatively small position limits, but kind of multi-cycle track record. Polymarket is a newer venue, theoretically open only to non-U.S. participants, with most of the activity conducted in crypto. So Polymarket's leaned a little bit more to the right. There's some questions about which one is a better measure. We tend to look at both of them. And then there's now a newer entrant in Kalshi, which is sort of just now in the process of litigation against the CFTC about whether or not they'll be able to get involved in a more sort of full-fledged way as like a genuine sort of options trading venue in the U.S. under sort of complete sign-off from the authorities. That's new enough and has small enough volumes this cycle that we're not looking very closely at it, but those are the main sort of sources of betting market odds, along with the actual kind of odds makers in terms of traditional bookies and so forth. Some of them publish odds also, so we try to look at all of them.
And when it comes to the presidential race, what are these markets telling you right now?
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, they have shifted pretty significantly back in Trump's favor over the course of the past 2 weeks. I think for the most part, they've tracked relatively closely with the odds that are generated by the kind of polling-based probabilistic forecasts. We tend to follow those models most closely. I think they're the thing that has the best track record. The betting markets, I think, are a really good way of getting real-time pulse on what's going on. The great indicator of consensus, a good way, when you're in the middle of a period of volatility, like during the Harris-Trump debate, for example, they swung in real time. I think that was a good indicator, a good gut check that many other observers are seeing the same thing that we were seeing, which was Harris kind of handily winning that debate. But we've seen some irrational exuberance in those markets in the past. In late 2022, for example, there was a lot of narrative about a so-called red wave in those midterm elections that was never really borne out by the polling. So, the polling shifted a little bit to the right in the late, the kind of final weeks of that campaign, with a lot of Republican-sponsored pollsters in particular kind of putting out a lot of polls. In their view, things were shifting, like breaking late for Republicans. The betting market swung, I think, much farther than the polling in that direction and turned out to fall short. So I think not, there's some, we get questions sometimes that are like, aren't the markets just the best indicator of what's going to happen here if they're taking in all the available information? It's people who have real money at stake as opposed to pollsters just taking their best guess. And it hasn't really panned out that way. So, at the moment, in the presence of a little bit of a disagreement between the polling-based models and the betting markets, we're, I think, a little more in line with the polling. But, at a minimum, it's an indication that there are, the consensus is shifting. And I think there's more openness to the possibility that Trump may have a real durable edge here as opposed to the coin flip election that a lot of people have been seeing for the past couple of months.
Well, Tobin, I do want to move on and ask you about polls. We all know that hindsight is 20/20, but before we move on to polls, because you mentioned the word crypto, and that is a market that we can watch 24/7 versus the bond market or stock market, and given a lot of the events that happened this summer regarding the presidential race, candidates as well as assassination attempts, it was very interesting to hear the crypto community react. And I'm not just talking about price action in terms of Bitcoin or the crypto majors, but what do you think about crypto as a campaign issue and just how this community has gotten so involved?
Yeah, no, it's been a really interesting cycle. I think certainly we've seen the emergence of both institutional crypto players as a lobbying force, a campaign donor force, and to some extent like grassroots individual crypto owners as an important political constituency. It's definitely, I think, still niche in terms of the number of voters for whom that is the decisive issue, which is a much smaller group, obviously, than the set of people who own or have ever owned crypto that you see in some of these surveys. But this is very much going to be a campaign that's decided on the margins. So even relatively small groups I think have a chance to be influential. We're seeing that again this week with Harris rolling out this sort of targeted kind of black opportunity agenda that includes essentially a kind of promise to protect crypto assets, making an attempt to say, if you are, sort of younger black man, for example, where survey data shows crypto ownership is relatively high, if the reason why you're thinking about voting for Trump is because you think he's going to protect your crypto investments and Harris won't, she's going to try and reassure you, take that issue off the table. So, I do think that from a policy perspective, the crypto regulatory environment is moving in a friendlier direction one way or another. Trump's been very overt about that. But even if Harris wins, I think we've seen, to some extent, the SEC reach the limits of what courts are going to let it do in terms of its aggressive sort of, regulation by enforcement approach that it's been taking. We've seen some signs of growing interest in actually getting something done in terms of digital asset regulation in Congress. There's this bill called Fit 21 that got through the House on a very strong bipartisan vote, including some surprising support from sort of senior Democratic leadership in the House, including Speaker Jeffries a couple months ago. So I think that the legislative period at the end of this year might be too soon to get that done because it's going to be a very, very contentious period given that we'll be coming off of this closely fought election. We may still be in the middle of election litigation by the time it comes time, like the legislative window kind of opens. But if we play the thread out a couple years, I think no matter who wins in November, I do think there's going to be bipartisan interest in getting some kind of structure in place for crypto that's both more predictable and a little bit less hostile than it's been for the past couple years.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to watch what happens, not just in the coming weeks or months, but heading into the new year when it comes to crypto legislation. But since you mentioned surveys, I think it's a good time to talk about polls and polling when it comes to the presidential election. So the polls are showing a toss-up in the presidential race with key battleground states still close. So what do you make of what we're seeing in polls, and can you give us an understanding of how they work and what to pay attention to?
Yeah, so the polling industry, polling is a tough business. I'll say as someone who spent some time working in polling, I would not advise any of our audience to invest in. If you have a chance to invest in a pollster, I'd tell you not to. I think the industry has struggled for years with the problem of falling response rates. I think there's been a lot of interesting adaptation to that. Polling today is more multimodal. There's more efforts to draw respondents from multiple different channels, whether it's live callers, calling cell phones, sampling from online convenience panels, SMS-based interviewing, where you're recruiting people to take surveys online based on text to their phone. Some people will do mail recruitment of sort of consistent panels that they go back to and survey over and over again. So I think we do see diversity of methods. I think that does help for correct for some of the shortcomings of any individual polling methodology, but it is definitely a challenge. That being said, I don't think that polling is kind of broken or ought to be ignored. Obviously, there were big polling misses underestimating Trump's support in 2016 and 2020, but we had quite accurate polling in 2018 and 22. So, we're cognizant of the possibility that this could be a Trump-specific effect. Maybe there are voters who are Trump supporters, but not consistent Republican supporters, or people who don't turn out in midterms, that those are the people that are sort of most challenging to capture. So we could easily see another polling error in Trump's favor, but I think the starting point ought to be that polling, is capturing important information, that it works. I think it's better as a sort of prior than anything else that you can go on. Again, looking back 2 years, we saw a lot of people in 2022 go very wrong with an assumption that either polling is totally broken, and so we should be crafting our expectations for this election just based on the context, which, with inflation then running totally out of control, would have pointed to a kind of huge washout win for Republicans. Or on the other hand, that you just ought to tack on 3 or 4 points of Republican support to any poll because it's consistently underestimating Republicans. Again, that pointed people towards expecting a red wave that never really materialized. So, we tend to look at the averages more than individual polls. There certainly are some polls that are higher quality than others, but I think generally the models have acquitted themselves pretty well. Even looking back at some of these cycles that have had big misses, like in 2016, the betting markets then had put even higher odds on a Clinton win than, for example, Nate Silver's model did at the time. So I think even in these periods where the polling has missed, polling-based models that do a good job of accounting for uncertainty in the way that they do the probabilistic forecasting, I think have been a better guide towards the likelihood of different outcomes than the betting markets of those times have. In terms of what we're seeing in the polling, it's been very close. All 7 of the swing states are well within a very typical polling error. But thus far, pretty consistently going back to August, Harris has maintained narrow leads, sort of in the 0.5 to 2 point range in enough states to get to 270. So could go either way. It would not be at all surprising to see a polling error in either direction, but it's better to be ahead than behind. So that's what we tend to give an edge to Harris as a very slight favorite based on that polling, despite the level of uncertainty that we're looking at here.
And we have about 3 weeks to go, so I'm sure whether or not it's advisable for the health of your blood pressure or not, I'm sure we'll continue to keep an eye on those polls. And I do want to take a look at policy because I think it's very important, obviously, when we're talking about the candidates and the implications here. So let's just say that we get a Trump win. What are the most significant policy shifts that you expect that investors need to account for here?
Absolutely, and from an investor perspective, certainly policy is what it really comes down to. These elections only matter for markets insofar as they're actually changing the kind of policy inputs that are going to shape outcomes in these sectors. So, look, I think in terms of things that that we're looking at is relevant to markets in Trump's first year if he wins. I think first and foremost, tariffs are probably the biggest question. Again, this is a place where he has tremendous latitude to do what he wants to do. I think it's something that he is very serious about. That's been a debate. Certainly we've heard some other consultants, mostly on the kind of business-friendly Republican side of things, telling people, ultimately his bark is worse than his bite. He wants markets to go up. He's going to say crazy stuff but do something that makes sense. We read him as being pretty sincerely committed to his tariff agenda and a pretty genuine believer in the power of tariffs as an economic tool. So I think that's a risk that investors need to take seriously. He's talked about 60% tariffs on all Chinese imports, as well as 10% or higher tariffs on all U.S. imports from anywhere around the world. And I think the latter of those, the 10% global tariff, that to us looks more like a negotiating posture that's going to lead to be the sort of threat that is the premise for a set of conversations with our major trading partners to try and get concessions, whether it's trade concessions, currency, FDI, any number of things. But the China piece of that we do take quite seriously. So that is one of the biggest sectoral risks, and probably the biggest shaper of the differences in the macro outlook between Trump and Harris, because that is something that I think has important impacts on inflation, to some extent on growth, and certainly on Fed policy as we get deeper into 25 into 2026. The second big category, I think, is regulatory shifts. Trump's been quite transparent that he wants to move in a broadly deregulatory direction. Biden's had a pretty aggressive regulatory agenda across sectors. Substantially all of that stands to be rolled off under Trump. I think the big winners there are probably financials, to some extent traditional energy, although I'd be less confident that the benefit for energy is durable. I think that's a place where you probably get positive sentiment immediately after a Trump win. But the actual cost of the energy regulations that Biden's put in place are pretty backloaded, so it's not as clear to me that you see sort of persistent benefit for energy throughout an entire second term, which for what it's worth would be in line with his first term when we saw energy kind of pop shortly after the win and then underperform in the 2017 to 21 period. The third category, I think, would be immigration. Certainly we're going to see Trump clamping down on flows of the border, for example, by ending the humanitarian parole programs that Biden's put in place that are effectively letting in about 75,000 people a month on a kind of a quasi-legal basis. The question there is, from an internal enforcement perspective, is he really going to be able to deport 1 million, 5 million, 15, 20 million people, as he's indicating that he wants to? We think that that's going to prove pretty operationally challenging, so we don't necessarily expect that big an increase in the pace of deportations, but if he does sort of manages to do more there than we're expecting, that's something where you do have to worry about both the supply and the demand side of the labor market. With I think retrospectively, the levels of immigration that we've seen over the course of the past couple of years have been an important ingredient in being able to run payrolls fairly hot without, at the same time that we're bringing inflation down. Looking forward, as payrolls have cooled, a little bit less concerned about the inflationary risks, but again, if you start pulling millions of people out of the labor market, then we start to get more concerned again. And then finally, tax policy, as I mentioned before, we have a huge tax cliff at the end of next year. It's going to need to get addressed somehow, no matter who wins. If Trump wins, I think he's probably coming with Republican House and Senate, and so they will use reconciliation, which is a sort of special legislative procedure that you can use to get fiscal bills to the Senate with 50 votes rather than 60. So that means if every Republican can hold together, and there will be a very strong incentive to do so, they can push through essentially whatever they want to. But the deficit is going to be a concern. We're starting with a $4 trillion plus price tag just to prevent taxes from going up. That's in the context of a debt to GDP ratio that's 100% and rising. So I do think that there will be some sticker shock around that bill. Trump's proposing $10 trillion plus in tax cuts at this point. Certainly they're not going to be able to do all of that. So I think that there will definitely be some triaging there and some tough conversations about the extent to which they need to throw in fiscal offsets to bring the price tag down. That's the context in which we worry about partial IRA rollback, where I do think that there will be a lot of interest across many parts of the Republican Party, not in root and branch repeal, not in an immediate cliff of all these clean energy tax credits in 2026, but in scaling them back over time as part of an effort to make the numbers add up on that package.
And Tobin, you've covered so many issues, and I wish we had time to dive into each and every one that you mentioned. But I do have to ask you about the same for Harris. But before we do that, just given that there's been so much confusion over tariffs and how they actually work, can you just give us a brief overview of how tariffs are implemented and who ends up bearing the burden of these tariffs?
Yeah, so the president has a wide variety of different authorities to impose tariffs in the U.S. The China tariffs that Trump imposed in the 2018 and 19 trade war were done through a provision called Section 301. Our expectation is that he would use that same tool to do China tariffs this time around. The bigger question is around these global tariffs, which are more novel. There's been conversation about Trump using a law called IEEPA, which is a sort of general purpose international emergency economic authority, along with a few kind of little used provisions of the overall tariff toolbox that presidents have. One way or another, I think they will probably be able to cobble together the legal authorities to do what they want to do. So it's more a question of will and judgment than it is a question of legal authority. In terms of who bears the brunt, the economics is clear that largely the cost ends up being internalized by U.S. consumers rather than being internalized by Chinese producers or other foreign producers. Currency adjustments can absorb some of that. When we look back at studies of the China trade war in Trump's first term, you certainly do see some level of the tariff shock being absorbed by Chinese producers, but the majority of it flowed back into U.S. consumers. And so that's why, when you look at this kind of surveys of economists, like the Wall Street Journal had another one this week, they overwhelmingly agree that Trump's agenda looks pretty inflationary and more so than Harris's. So I mean, we get a lot of questions about this from China, like doesn't the fact that this is an obviously inflationary policy in the context of a still somewhat unlanded, inflation picture, shouldn't that stop him from doing it? And again, we just point back to how he's talking about it, what he says. He does seem to be quite sincerely committed to this, despite the fact that a lot of economists have made this point. He does not seem convinced.
And of course, I do want to ask you about a potential Harris win. So the same question that I asked you for Trump, what would this mean if we did get Harris in the White House? Yeah,
so I mean, a Harris win looks a lot more status quo, both because she's coming off 4 years of Democratic governance already, which means that a lot of, from a regulatory perspective, for example, a lot of the ideas that are floating around to the Democratic side have either been implemented or tried and failed, since Biden has attempted a lot of regulatory moves that ended up getting struck down by courts. There's a pretty big disparity right now between conservative-leaning courts and what has been a very aggressive crop of progressive regulators under Biden. So things like student loans, things like caps on credit card late fees from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a lot of that stuff has run into serious problems in the courts. I think we're mostly looking at the status quo from a regulatory and executive action perspective, with not a lot of new ideas that have any chance of surviving litigation. And then from a legislative perspective, I think she's pretty much going to be forced into bipartisan fiscal deals as the main outcomes of next year. If she doesn't have the Senate, as we expect that she won't, the stuff that she's proposing kind of week in and week out, whether it's these new, the big expansion of the child tax credit that you mentioned, subsidies for housing, her so-called care economy proposals in terms of child care, or the proposal to cover long-term care in Medicare that she rolled out last week, none of that, I think, is realistically going to be doable in a bipartisan Congress. So, in the first half of the year, they'll need to raise the debt ceiling again. I'm optimistic that will be a less tumultuous process than the 2023 debt ceiling showdown was, but probably will result in some extension of discretionary spending caps, again, as we saw in 2023. And then after that, they'll move on to this tax debate. And I think we're looking at extending most of the expiring provisions, as first Biden and then Harris has proposed to do, but allowing some of them to expire on higher-end households, sort of broadly the top 5% of households, those making more than $400,000 a year, is the threshold over which Democrats want to let these tax cuts expire. And I think we'll end up with something that pretty closely resembles that. And that's what happened in 2012 when we finally dealt with the expiration of the 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts, is we ended up extending most of them, making most of them permanent, allowing them to expire at the high end as part of a bipartisan deal. If that happens, I think that's a pretty benign set of outcomes for markets. Relatively little shift on the regulatory side, relatively limited tax increases, which has some level of contractionary fiscal shock, but with very low multipliers. The place sectorally where I think there's an underappreciated impact is on REITs and MLPs, master limited partnerships. These pass-through entities do get a special 20% tax deduction. That is one of the things that stands to expire. And so if that's allowed to expire at the high end, as I think it would in divided government under Harris, you'd be looking at effectively roughly a 10 percentage point increase in the top marginal rate on income from REITs and MLPs when that income actually is realized by individuals and they have to pay individual taxes on it. To my mind, that ought to pretty significantly reduce aggregate market appetite to hold those assets and cost some rotation out of them, and that's something we've found has flown very far under the radar. But it is those kinds of niche impacts that we'd be looking at in a Harris win scenario, because there's just not room for the kinds of huge shifts that are possible on areas like tariffs if Trump wins.
And finally, before I let you go, I do want to ask you about sectors in terms of the biggest winners if Trump wins and if Harris wins.
Yeah, so if Trump wins, I think financials are probably the single clearest winner, along with crypto. To the extent that we're thinking about crypto as a distinct sector, I think certainly that would be a winner. Financials, I think, are a place where financials and energy are the sectors that have traditionally overperformed in election years when Republican presidents end up winning. And then you also have, I think, some pretty material regulatory levers that would move in a more friendly direction under Trump, with the Basel III endgame rules being first and foremost among them. Huge issue for large cap banks over the past couple of years. Alongside FINs, I think traditional energy to some extent, parts of managed care, those are probably the sort of biggest winners under Trump. And then under Harris, I think it's mostly about the sectors that win from taking off risks if Trump wins. So clean energy is probably the clearest one if you can get that IRA repeal risk off the table. To some extent, China-exposed names in the industrial and consumer sector, I think, are winners. But the tariff risks have been a little bit less priced into markets over the course of the year, so I wouldn't necessarily bet on kind of big pops for some of those China-exposed names, but I do think they see downside under Trump. It's not there under Harris. And then in the healthcare space, again, I think the managed care picture is kind of bifurcated. Under Trump, the names that are most exposed to Medicare Advantage tend to win. Under Harris, the likelihood that you get these expanded tax credits in the Affordable Care Act exchanges would be probably extended under Harris, probably expire under Trump. And so for the managed care names that are more levered to Medicaid and the exchanges, I think those probably stand out as winners under Harris as well.
Okay, Tobin, well, we have to wrap it up for today, but thank you so much for giving us such a great overview as we edge closer to that election day here in the U.S.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And that will do it for Global Money Talk live from the New York Stock Exchange. We're so excited to bring you daily coverage here on SamProTV. You can check out the show anytime on our YouTube channel by searching Global Money Talk. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great day.